Welcome to today's online learning event, conducting Painless Performance Evaluation Meetings, sponsored by CRG emPerform. We are very excited to be able to present this event and thank all of you for attending. Before we begin, please note there is a question tab in the control pane on your screen. Please send your questions throughout the presentation. We will be doing a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Once the webinar has ended, a window will appear for you to open that contains a survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey. Audio for our webcast is streamed over the internet and available through the speakers on your PC. If you are in an open office, we recommend you use headphones. Today's session and the PowerPoint slides will be posted on hr.com's archives within 48 hours. Please feel free to share this archive with coworkers and friends. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce our sponsor, CRG emPerform. emPerform provides all-inclusive web-based talent management software. If you want to learn more about emPerform, please check out employeeperformance.com. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Marnie Green, Principal Consultant of the Management Education Group and the author of Painless Performance Evaluations, a practical approach to managing day-to-day employee performance. Active in several professional associations, Marnie is a member of the American Society for Training and Development, the Society for Human Resource Management, and has served in leadership roles for the International Public Management Association for Human Resources. She is a frequent speaker at local, national, and international conferences on workforce-related issues, including leadership development, recruiting and retaining top talent, the future workforce, and performance management. Thank you very much, Marnie, for hosting this event, and I'll let you get started.
Thanks so much, John, and welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here. And as you can see from the slide in front of you, my passion and my heart has always been with helping leaders feel more confident. And I truly believe that by focusing on the practice of performance management, we can have greater success with our organizations in terms of impact and outcomes. And today's webcast is intended to be a very practical, hands-on look at the dreaded and often avoided performance evaluation conversation. And it really is a conversation that should accompany the delivery of every performance evaluation. And I believe that the face-to-face end of review period conversation is one of the most powerful tools a supervisor has to drive employee engagement and higher levels of performance. We've all heard the horror stories of this opportunity being missed or misused altogether. So today we're going to explore how to turn the end of the year conversation into one that is actually anticipated, maybe even looked forward to, and seen as a must-have event in the life of employees. So to achieve that ideal end of the year performance evaluation conversation, we have to have some new eyes on this. And I truly believe that the old way that we've done this is not the new way, that there's got to be a new approach to how we have these conversations if they're going to be seen as anything meaningful and productive. So our plan today, hold on just a minute, is to begin talking about the tone and where to have these meetings, how the meetings should be managed. We'll then talk about the role of questions, and I'm going to propose to you today that questions really are the basis for these conversations, and when supervisors do all the talking and don't engage employees in the conversation, that's when it becomes painful. So we'll explore the role of questions, and I'll also provide you with a roadmap or an agenda for what one of these meetings should follow, or a new approach to this meeting. Along the way, I'll offer you one question that you must ask at the beginning of every one of these performance evaluation conversations. And we'll finish by talking about the 2/3, 1/3 rule, which provides some framework for how you spend your time in the conversation. We'll finish up the webinar with some recommendations for next steps, offer you some additional resources, and conclude in 1 hour. Let me begin with a very brief review of the concept of performance management. And my guess is that many of you on the line know this. This is basic stuff. But I also find it's what we often don't do when we're managing performance. If we're really managing employee performance effectively, it's all tied to everything we do. All of our efforts are focused on your organization's goals, strategic plans, and mission. And then those are translated, or you may even say cascaded, down to individual performance plans. And then hopefully the manager and the employee have regular conversations about performance, make adjustment to those expectations, and use some kind of a system, likely an online talent management system, to maintain documentation. And that happens throughout the entire year or cycle, however long your performance management cycle is. And if you've done that well, it makes preparing the performance evaluation easy. And then when you get to delivering a performance evaluation, then it's really more about talking. You don't have to go backwards and give the feedback again because it's already been discussed. It's really more about planning for the future. So it's a cyclical process. Our focus today is going to be just on the performance evaluation discussion. And I will note that there are lots of other skills involved to make this work and for it to be painless. But our focus today, and considering our time, will be just on that discussion. And I'd like to also frame what we mean by painless. My definition of a painless performance evaluation is one that by the time you get to the end of the year and you're having the conversation with the employee about the document or about the ratings, three things are happening. One is that there are no surprises. You've probably heard this, you know this is the way it's supposed to be. However, that can't happen if we haven't had regular conversations and regular feedback throughout the cycle. Second is that the conversation itself is not something we do to the employee, but rather something we do with the employee. And that can only happen if we're approaching performance evaluations as a collaborative, engaged process that we involve the employees in. And then finally, I believe that it can be painless, but only if the focus is on the future. So if a performance evaluation is all about telling the employee what they've done right and what they've done wrong in the past, the employee is going to be left with a little bit of vacancy, if you will, a little bit of where do I go from here? And so we've found that when you address a performance evaluation with the focus on going forward rather than going on backwards, it becomes much more tolerable and actually more meaningful to the employee. So today I'd like to show you how all of this comes together in the conversation when you deliver the performance evaluation. So let's begin talking about the tone and how and where to have these conversations. So this is a pretty simple, obviously, you want to choose the appropriate setting. But in my conversations with managers in the workshops that I do, I found that there are a lot of different ideas about the right place and the right time to do a performance evaluation. So I'd like to start with a poll. And this allows you to use the GoToWebinar interface. So soon you'll see the poll and you'll be able to click on your screen. And the question I'm going to be asking you in this poll is, what is the ideal setting for a performance evaluation meeting? So give me a moment. I'm going to launch this poll. All right. And you should be able to, yep, let me see, poll open. You should be able to see the poll at this point. There. And if you would, go ahead and click on where you think is the ideal setting for a performance evaluation. Is it in the supervisor's office with the door closed, in a conference room, in the car while you're driving, at a Starbucks over coffee? I'll give you about 10 more seconds. Okay. I think we've got most of the folks. We've got a pretty large percentage that have voted. And so I'll go ahead and close the poll. This is very interesting, not a big surprise. And let me share the results with you. I'm hoping you can see the results. There we go. So it looks like 59% of you said do it in the conference room, 32% in the supervisor's office. I think what you're saying there is that it should be in a private place where there is focus on the employee and not a lot of distraction, which I would completely agree with. However, I'd like to suggest that the performance evaluation conversation, while those two, particularly the conference room or the supervisor's office, are probably more on the ideal side, it actually can happen anywhere as long as the focus is on the employee and you're not going to be interrupted. I include that example of having it in the car while you're driving because I still remember one of my very early supervisors when I was really early in my career. We actually did the performance evaluation while on a long drive to a client site. And, you know, it was very, very productive. And I don't know if it was because neither one of us had direct eye contact or whether it was just because there were no other distractions but our conversation with one another. And it gave us a chance to just talk and really be honest with one another. So while I would agree a focused professional setting is appropriate, sometimes the most valuable conversations can happen in any place, including the car or even at a Starbucks. And I suppose the ideal is one of those that you chose. But just to keep in mind, sometimes it's just a matter of wherever you and the employee can best connect. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about the setting, and I'll summarize this. I think the important thing is that when you have this conversation, it's not something you do in the hallway, it's not something you do with other people around, and it needs to be done in a place where you don't allow distractions. No Blackberries, no keyboards, no iPhones, nothing that will take your attention or the employee's attention away from the conversation. Because what we're doing is we're sending a message to the employee that says, you're important. You are number one to me in this conversation. And that's really it really sets the tone then. And the other thing I'd like to recommend is that as you go into the conversation, ready to deliver the performance evaluation, remember that your purpose is not to control the conversation. It's not about controlling the employee. This isn't something we're going to do to them, but rather the focus is on development. The focus is on what do we do to help this employee improve their performance and improve their contribution to the organization. And we do that by asking more than we tell, by being prepared to ask open-ended questions that engage the employee, and we're going to explore that in a moment. Now, a lot of folks will ask, well, how long should this conversation last? I would recommend that based on the model that I'll share with you today, it's typically a 30-minute conversation, although I do know there are some organizations where the employees are not real verbal and they can get the conversation done in a shorter amount of time. And I must also admit that I've had conversations with employees that have lasted anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes. So it really depends on the nature of the job and the complexity of the goals that you're setting and how you go about it. But more important than the setting and where, I believe, is how you go about leading the meeting and what you bring to it in terms of your perspective. And what you spend time on will indicate what's important to you and then communicate your value to the employee. So I'd like to then ask you a second poll, and that question is, what's the typical approach to delivering a performance evaluation in your organization? And so let me launch that poll. You should see that poll by now. Yep, got some people voting, so I'll give you about 30 seconds. About 5 more seconds for that poll, if you would. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and we'll talk a little bit about your responses. Let me share that. So I put these options up there for you to make a point. I have worked with organizations where the supervisor hands the document to the employee and says, read this, if you have questions, let me know. Or emails it to the employee and says the same thing. And essentially, loses the opportunity for a conversation at all, or does not grab that part of the conversation. The second approach that I've seen is that the supervisor reads the document to the employee, and the employee sits there and they take it. The third option that I've seen take is that the employee actually talks with the employee, but they talk about the document. They don't necessarily talk about the performance or how the employee perceives what's going on. So the focus is much more on the ratings and the form and all of that as opposed to than the performance. My recommendation is where 48% of you answered, and I highly recommend that the conversation, instead of being about the document, the ratings, or anything else that we avoid, or avoiding the conversation altogether, is rather to make the conversation about the employee's performance. And solely on that, and not focus on those ratings, because what we find is when it's focused on the ratings and it's read to them, the employee really it creates an opportunity for debate, and I have rarely found that there's benefit in that, in debating whether the employee's performance was a 4 or a 5, or whether all the right boxes were checked. But rather, if we can focus on the performance, then we can very quickly move to what do they need to do differently in the future. So that's my approach. I'd like to then take you, hopefully you're getting the right slides. There we go. To take you into some concepts that help us create this environment where the supervisor can engage the employee in a conversation about performance and not about ratings and not about the evaluation. And it's really driven, the basis for all of this is driven with questions. And we truly believe that a painless performance evaluation conversation, or really any kind of performance-related conversation, is going to be driven by thought-provoking, challenging questions that put the responsibility for the performance back on the employee. Now, the basics of this, I think you know, 2 kinds of questions. There's open and closed. So if I ask you, where were you born? And you answer Ashland, Ohio, I've gotten a little nugget, but I haven't gotten a lot. If I ask an open-ended question like, tell me about your experiences growing up, I'm more likely to learn more. So the same goes true in the performance evaluation conversation. We just don't want to say, do you agree or not? Or, but I'd rather have you ask, tell me what you think about the evaluation. Another closed-ended question might be something like, do you like your job? Yes or no, or sort of, or I don't know, might be the answer. Where an open-ended question is more appropriate, what do you like or dislike about your job? You're likely to do a much deeper dive in terms of learning from the employee and engaging them in the conversation. Even still, you've got to be prepared to keep things going, because many times we have employees who are resistant to participating, especially if you haven't created a culture in your organization that includes employees and where employees are used to being involved in the conversations. So as you ask these open-ended questions, you have to be prepared with conversation starters or igniters, questions that will keep the conversation going. So you might want to try starters like, once you ask, what do you like about your job, rather than taking one answer and stopping, continue to ask questions like, or use statements like, go on, or tell me more, why do you say that? To continue to encourage the employee to give you their perspective, as well as to find out what they're truly thinking, because the first thing that comes out of their mouth often is not the only thing that's in their mind. Other starters might be questions like, how do you mean, or can you give me an example of that? I work with a lot of managers that have told me that, I ask an open-ended question and I still get a closed-ended answer, and the employee doesn't want to participate. And that's, I think, pretty typical. But what we also find is that the employee or the supervisor seals their fate when they don't ask another open-ended question to follow. If we only ask one and the employee doesn't participate, and we let the employee off the hook, then they're very quickly trained that you really don't want to hear from them, or that you're really not serious about finding out what's going on in their mind. So I like to also recommend that if you run into an employee who just doesn't want to play, doesn't want to contribute, give them the what else 3 times test. Basically, what else 3 times means that you're going to ask an open-ended question or use a conversation starter at least 3 times to attempt to engage them in the conversation. So you might say, what do you like most about your job? Or what surprised you about the performance evaluation? When the employee responds with, I don't know, you don't just move on to the next question. You say, well, why do you say that? Or how do you mean? And if they say, oh, I don't know, I think the evaluation's fine, you might say, well, tell me more. Or what else? So we're going to ask 3 times before we give up. And if you get stuck, there's 2 easy questions. If you really don't know what to ask, try this one. How do you feel? And for those of you that feel is maybe a little too touchy-feely, you might want to use the word think. But what do you think about the evaluation? What do you think about the changes we've implemented? What do you think about the direction of the organization? What do you think about this project? And it's a real nice start to opening up the conversation. And if that isn't enough, another question that's very helpful is, what do you need? What do you need to be able to meet your goals? What do you need to be able to feel fully engaged here? What do you need so that we can retain you because you're one of our stars? So asking questions very simply, how do you feel, what do you need, oftentimes sets that tone that we want the employee to be engaged in this conversation. Now, I have a challenge for you, a little bit of homework. I would challenge you to attempt to maintain a conversation with a colleague for 3 whole minutes. And your job as the person driving this conversation is to only ask questions. Don't give your perspective, don't give your opinions. Every time you get a response from the other person, you follow with another question. I find this exercise is really helpful because it allows us to be very conscious of the quality of our questions and how we're guiding conversations. And in just 3 minutes, it's very easy to realize how often we want to do the talking and give the perspective as opposed to truly engaging and learning from the conversation. I would also recommend you try this with family members. I had a manager in one of my workshops once who I challenged him to try this with his wife. And it was a 2-day workshop with a week in between. And so after the first workshop, he said, Marnie, I'm going to try this. I'm going to go and try this with my wife. And he returned a week later for the second day of the workshop. And as soon as he walked through the door in that morning, he said, oh my goodness, that exercise completely changed my marriage. And he was beaming from ear to ear. I'm not exactly sure what that was about. But he did say that he said that his wife really thinks he's paying attention, that he's really interested in her. And I'm not sure if he really was or not, but he said just the act of asking questions and waiting for answers and then asking another question changed the dynamic in the relationship. And I think it can do the same thing with employees. With that, I'd like to then introduce you to the agenda for this evaluation meeting. And we have some basic concepts down now. So let's talk about the roadmap or the agenda. Many of the managers that I work with haven't really even considered a formal agenda for the performance evaluation meeting. They conduct the evaluation meetings the way they've always been led by their managers. They model. And that may or may not have been a productive way to manage this opportunity. In other organizations, there are just some bad practices in how evaluations are delivered. I hear about them all the time. And some of the evaluations are just read to the employee. In other organizations, the manager emails it and just asks if there's questions. And then in still others, the evaluation meeting is just avoided altogether. And we know that each of these practices does not fully capitalize on the opportunity to engage employees in their day-to-day life, in their day-to-day work lives, and find out what ideas they have for improving the work environment. So because we know that this conversation can be such a powerful tool to recognize and engage and drive performance, we've got to have a better way to approach it. So here's an approach that I believe is easy to follow, a simple 6-step model. And I'll show you the model now, and then we'll break it down and each section, and I'll give you some examples. So the first step is to start with an introduction. And in a moment, I'll give you some steps and some tips on how to open the conversation. Then we move to the employee's viewpoint. We know that if we're going to create this environment where the employee is a partner in this conversation, we need to engage them very early and we need to engage them thoroughly. So I recommend you start with questions rather than starting with talking. And once the employee's view has been fully explored, then it's time for the supervisor to give their perspective. But I would recommend that the supervisor's viewpoint is very, very brief. Because if you've done a thorough job in completing the performance evaluation document or process, your view is already in that document. And so it doesn't need to be reiterated to the employee verbally at least 100%. And I'll show you the balance there in a moment. But that once you've had your chance to give your perspective, I recommend that very, very quickly you move to talking about the future. Talking about what the goals are, the training will be, and where the employee would like to focus their performance for the future. If this is an employee who's struggling with their performance, this is the time to talk about what they're going to be doing so that next year is better than this past year. And if you've got a star performer, one who you know you want to retain, this part of the conversation is about what do you want to do next year that will keep you so engaged and so excited about your job that you wouldn't even think about leaving us. And I would recommend that the majority of the time be spent here. Once you've explored the future, I always like to end by giving the employee the last word. There is no reason that the supervisor needs to control this and have the final say or win the conversation. So I like to end with a few more open-ended questions to find out if there's anything else the employee has on their mind that we need to discuss. I'll share with you in a moment what that looks like. And then we can finish on a constructive note, and typically the end of the conversation is about the logistics of your system and how to process the performance evaluation. So let's start with the introduction. And even before we talk about that, I'd like to propose that there is really just one question that must start every single performance evaluation conversation that you have. It should be the first thing that comes out of your mouth as the supervisor. And that question is, have you read the performance evaluation yet? Have you had a chance to read the document? So think about this. If we start with this question, it assumes, number one, that you've shared the evaluation document with the employee before the meeting, whether it's a paper copy or an electronic copy through your talent management system. This question also assumes that the employee has had adequate time to reflect on the contents of the evaluation. So the employee comes into the conversation already understanding your perspective, already knowing what the ratings are, so that we have a level playing field in terms of understanding, and we can go from there. Now, I would like to note that if you're using an automated talent management system like our sponsor emPerform provides, you'll be able to even see if the employee has read the evaluation prior to the meeting. And in fact, with emPerform, you can even see down to the date and the time that they read it. So I'm assuming that if you've sent it to them either electronically or hard copy, they've read it. Then we know that we can continue with the conversation. So that introduction is really to put the employee at ease, state the purpose of the meeting, and then ask them if they had a chance to read the performance evaluation. So you might start with, hi, how are you doing? Did you catch the game last night? Or, you know, whatever your set the tone kind of banter is about. The purpose of the meeting is to discuss their performance for the last year, not to discuss the evaluation, but to discuss their performance, and then ask them if they've had a chance to read the evaluation. As hopefully they say yes, and then you get to follow with all those open-ended questions that we talked about previously. So that leads us to the employee's view. And I think this is probably the most critical part of a painless performance evaluation, that if you really want to see that employees are involved and don't feel like this is something that's being done to them, we must spend time in this part of the agenda. So we'll begin by asking open-ended questions to learn the employee's perspective. You might ask things about their view of the job and the working climate. the obvious first question is, what do you think of the performance evaluation? Is there anything, did they notice anything that was left out? What surprised them about the performance evaluation? What concerns them about the performance evaluation? And just find out where their head is. You may also ask them for suggestions for changes or improvements in the job or in what they think they can do to be a stronger contributor to your organization. The trick at this point, though, is to keep them talking. So what we're trying to do is very early in the conversation, engage the employee and seek their perspective. And by asking these questions about how they view the job and how they view the evaluation, you'll quickly get a sense for how they feel about where they are right now and the evaluation and their entire job experience. And then you can build from there. I understand the employee in some cases may not be happy with the document. The sooner we find that out, the sooner we can start to move forward in helping them figure out what they need to do next to improve their performance. So it's critical that you're prepared with a slew of open-ended questions to keep the conversation going. And remember that a lot of employees who maybe aren't used to this approach will not automatically be engaged in the process, and they're not going to know how to respond. In fact, they might even kind of be like deer in the headlights. What do you mean you're asking me? Your goal is to keep them talking. Ask what else 3 times. I actually have a couple of questions that may be appropriate considering your process. So as you're trying to engage the employee early on, you might want to ask, what surprised you about the evaluation? Or what pleased you most about the evaluation? Or what challenges you most about your job? I think this is an important one. It acknowledges that you're not perfect. What did I forget to mention in the document? What can we do to make next year even more satisfying or more challenging or not as rough? Whatever's the appropriate approach. And then what can we do to ensure that you want to stay here? You know, as we're seeing the economy slowly turn around, we know that our biggest risk in our organizations is for our best talent to be looking for other opportunities, especially if your organization has struggled over the last couple of years and maybe not treated employees as generously as they were treated in the previous years. So having that conversation with them about what's it going to take to keep them because they are so valuable is important. Now, you know, another conversation igniter at this point in the conversation might be to reference actual examples of their work. And you may even want to provide examples of accomplishments that they've had and then ask them to give you their perspective on that, on what worked, what didn't, and how they would do it differently in the future. Automated talent management systems, the online systems, allow you to log details of performance throughout the year. And then in many of these systems, including emPerform, you're allowed to attach documents and files that illustrate the employee's performance. So if throughout the year you're using your system and attaching examples of performance to their performance record, you'll have a great source of content to discuss. And plus, this is good documentation that shows the employee you're paying attention, that when you're actively tracking and recording examples of performance, it says to the employee that you care. So now that we've talked about the getting the employee engaged, you're probably saying, well, when do I get to give my point of view? When do I get to tell them what I think of them? That's what happens in the next step. But I will again reiterate, this has to be really brief. They've already read your summary. So you don't need to go through it line by line. You don't need to read it to them. In fact, you don't even need to mention everything that's in it. I'd recommend you provide a quick summary of their performance and do that by listing 1 or 2 behaviors the employee should continue and why those behaviors are so important to the job. So it might be something like, you know, this year you had some real successes, and 2 successes that stand out for me are X and Y. And then I would then move into what are the employees' opportunities for improvement. We're not going to give them a laundry list of all the things they did wrong. You've probably had those conversations throughout the year, especially if they're a challenged performer. But rather you'll present what you see as opportunities for the future where they can get better. Remember, if we're going to make this painless, it needs to be about the future. So this part of the conversation may sound something like, You know, this past year you had a couple of challenges in the areas of customer service or meeting your production goals. And I'd really like to focus next year on specific activities that we can pursue to help you improve in those areas. The employee will know what you mean because you've documented the details in the document. The key here is to be brief and as quickly as possible, turn the conversation back to the employee to engage them in really the question about what's next. So that's the next step in the conversation, is to talk about the future and shift from the past to spend the majority of the time in the conversation here by asking the employee to contribute their ideas for where they'd like to go next year, how they think they can improve in the areas that they struggled in the previous year. And in many organizations, this is the time where you can begin or solidify your SMART goals. If your organization uses a goal-based performance evaluation system, there has to be a right time to, in your process, to define those goals that are specific and measurable, linked to organizational objectives with some kind of a time element. The discussion of SMART goals and goal setting is for another webcast, but this often, for many of the organizations I work with, this is the time that they at least start talking about the goals. So you can see that when you move to focusing on tangible next steps, it takes away quite a bit of the pain and adds a lot of hope to the conversation. Likewise, I would recommend that you ask the employee to share opportunities they'd like to pursue in the coming year. So this conversation is not about you telling them what they need to do next year or telling them what their goals are going to be, but rather you're engaging them in a conversation about what they also think. Employees know what they need to do to be successful. We just need to give them space and an opportunity to express that. So once you and the employee have explored what's it going to look like next year, the next step is to give them the last word. Why is it that we feel compelled to tell them again what we think they've done wrong oftentimes in these conversations? And I don't know that that necessarily takes us to a productive place. So I would recommend that once you've reviewed the past, you've planned the future, you then ask the employee how they feel about the plan and ask them what else. Do they have any other concerns, any other questions or ideas for making the next year productive and valuable for them and for your organization? You know, in this portion of the conversation, I've had employees tell me, you know, I'm comfortable with the plan, I'm excited about where we're going. Oh, and by the way, I need to tell you, I'm getting a divorce, or I'm expecting a child, or I'm having some other kind of an issue, and I want you to consider that as we move forward. This part of the conversation creates a little bit of space so that the employee has an opportunity to share what's on their mind, and they may not have had any other forum to do that. So hopefully they do. Hopefully they talk with you on a regular basis, and those are the kind of details that you know going in. But if you have an organization where your employees are geographically dispersed, or you have a very large span of control, and employees don't always feel like they have your ear, this creates a little bit of time for them to take advantage of telling you what they need to tell you. Most of the time, though, they'll tell them no. They'll say, no, I don't really have much more. I'm happy with the plan. And then you get to move on to the next step, which is really just the closing. You summarize your next steps in your process flow, in your online talent management system, you know, what happens next and what buttons need to be pushed or what forms need to be signed. We always want to end with an optimistic note, because this is more about the future than it is about the past. Thank them, and they're on their way. So that is the agenda for a painless performance evaluation. I'd like to summarize these concepts with just two other thoughts, and then I'll summarize and open up for questions. But the first is that there really is a ratio that helps us to manage this conversation so that we can get more towards that painless definition of being future focused and employee engaged with no surprises. And that framework is something that I call the 2/3, 1/3 rule. It applies actually to both time spent talking and time spent and focus, time spent on the past versus the future. So the first application is that if you've done this really well and you're truly intent on engaging the employee, 2/3 of the time will be spent having the employee talk and you asking questions, and 1/3 of the time you as the leader of the conversation doing the talking. You're really there, again, to learn and to develop, not to control. And if that's the case, 2/3 of the time in this conversation will be focused on the future and only 1/3 on the past. So if we apply this ratio to the conversation model that I've taken you through, it would look something like this. Let's assume, as we said, that the typical conversation lasts maybe 30 minutes. So we'd have maybe 2 minutes in the introduction, because all you're doing is you're saying, have you read the performance evaluation? 5 minutes for the employee's view, and maybe 3 minutes for you to give your summary. If you're spending more time on your summary and your viewpoint than they are talking, then you've got to do a little bit more asking. Keep in mind, too, that this is focused on the past, all of this. So we want that to be a small amount of time because we've already had conversations throughout the year and they've already read the document. So as quickly as you can, we want to get to the goals and training for the next year, or your plan for the next year, or whatever that looks like, but your future focus. And I would recommend that in a 30-minute conversation, probably 15 minutes is going to be spent here, because you're really laying the path for what it's going to take for that employee to be successful going forward. It's a chance to reiterate your expectations and to find out what their expectations are. That feedback from the employee might take 5 minutes, and the conclusion too. So if that's the case, all of this is focused on the future. So you'll notice that more time is being spent with, let me see if I can get my little pointer here to, so the employee's view and the goals and training for next year is 20 minutes of a 30-minute conversation. Now, you can extrapolate that if your conversations last longer or fewer minutes, but you can see most of the time is focused on getting the employee to engage, and less of the time is spent on you talking. So you're talking maybe here and maybe here and asking a question up here, but the rest of the time is the employee getting involved. So when you think about the performance evaluation meeting, I'd like to really encourage you to consider that this meeting, the purpose of the meeting is not to judge the employee. It's not to tell the employee that they're good, they're bad, and where you want to fix them, because it's not about controlling. It's more about engaging them in a positive conversation about the future and about their employment with your organization, and to focus on developing their skills rather than judging mistakes or errors in the past, things that can't be changed. You know, but much of the dynamic we've described here has to be created before this meeting even begins. The principles we've talked about here can be applied to your day-to-day approach to management. And so I would encourage you to think about just even day-to-day. Are you doing more talking, or are you doing more asking and listening? And that day-to-day sets the tone for more of a painless performance management. And I very much look forward to hearing your feedback on how the concepts that we've presented here and what we've offered here resonate with you. We'll be giving you some contact information at the end of the webcast for me, and you can visit my website for additional resources. I have lots of information about articles and blog postings, and would love to have you as part of my network in sharing ideas on how you can be a more effective supervisor. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to John and see if we have any questions that have come in.
Thank you, Marnie. Excellent webinar so far. We do have a few questions I'd like to throw your way. The first one is this. How do you handle future goals when the person has been in a position for years and there are no opportunities for growth? The example given was a production line worker. Right.
Well, I think part of it is how we define goals. And again, that could be a whole nother webcast, but let me give you the quick answer. If that employee's been with you for a very long time, it means that they have skills and we probably have expectations for their day-to-day performance. So if you are only seeing goals as activities that prepare them for the next level or improve their skills to get to a level of competency, then I think we're defining goals too narrowly. And many organizations will define goals as what the employee is expected to produce. So it might be that if that employee is a production worker and they have, the standard is that they have to produce 35 widgets a day, well, if they've been there so many years and they really know the intricacies of this process, is that a realistic expectation, or do they think that they can do more? So it might be a conversation about asking them, what do they think they truly can do with all those years of experience, and set the goal a little more challenging. The other approach that I've taken, and I actually had an employee who had been with the organization, well, longer than I'd been alive at the time. And he was very set in his ways. But he knew the process forwards and backwards. He knew our systems better than anybody because he'd been there through the entire history. So the goals that we settled on had to do with using his skill and his expertise to suggest improvements to the process. So in the process of doing his regular work, in addition to that, he was expected to do some research and come up with some suggestions for improvement or recommendations for enhancing our customer service that we actually then had him present to the staff and had the staff then discuss and buy into. So we were using that talent, we were using that experience to improve our processes and improve our organization. So short answer to the question though, John, is we've got to redefine how we use goals.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, very good. Another question that's come in from a few participants. Does the employee fill out the self-assessment ahead of time?
Oh, okay. Self-assessment is lots of different approaches to this, but I'll give you my perspective on this. I am a real believer in having the employee contribute their perspective prior to the supervisor completing the performance evaluation, so that you as the supervisor know what the employee is going to share with you, what they think their successes have been and maybe what their challenges have been. And so yes, I do believe asking for the employee's input ahead of time is critical. However, I'm not a big fan of having the employee rate themselves on the performance evaluation form. What I find is that if the employee rates themselves and the supervisor rates them, the discussion then becomes more about the ratings and whether we agree or we disagree. And in the process of doing that, we're less focused on the employee's performance. It becomes a negotiation. So my preference is that the employee self-assessment is really more of a, it might even be open-ended, where the employee tells you what were their accomplishments this year, what were their challenges this year, and what goals would they like to pursue in the coming year, but not to have them actually give you ratings or what they think they should be rated.
Okay, great, Marnie. We have a list of questions for you here, so I'm going to try to get them out to you. I know we've got about 8 minutes left looking at the time. The next question up is, would you recommend an appraisal more than once a year?
Okay, the ideal is that employees are getting feedback on a regular basis. So if your appraisal, formal appraisal, I think it's based on what your organization's needs are. Some organizations will do one formal appraisal every year because it's tied to some kind of a salary adjustment with their annual calendar. I think at a minimum, we want to have at least 2 opportunities to give the employee formal feedback, meaning there's one end of the year evaluation and maybe some mid-year touch base. Whether they get a rating or not at that point, I think is up to you. And I think ideally, the manager, the supervisor, and the employee are sitting down at least monthly or probably at a minimum quarterly to at least have a conversation about the performance. So it's really not just a conversation of how's it going? Oh, it's going fine, and then we're done. It's really a deep dive into what's working, what's not, and what do you need. And that's what we want to find out from the employee. And it also then opens up the conversation so that the employee, or so that the supervisor can give their perspective. So, I don't even know if you need, ratings all the way along. It really is your organization's preference, but the feedback should be happening much more frequently.
Okay. Next one, lots on this one, Marnie. What do you do? What do you do if an employee gets emotional in the appraisal meeting?
Yeah. Well, a couple of thoughts there. First of all, hopefully the employees, we can't control the employees' reactions. However, we can influence that if we've given them feedback along the way. So hopefully nothing in the conversation is a big surprise, because they've heard, if there's negative information, they've heard it multiple times before you even have this evaluation meeting. But that said, some of our employees are more emotional than others. And I think number one, it's you got to have some Kleenex with you if it's crying. If there's anger involved, you might want to take a short break, but always come back to the conversation. And we don't want to allow that emotion to get in the way of eventually exploring the issues and the roots of that, of whatever's triggering those emotions. So it's okay to take a break. It's okay to have a little bit of tears, but keep moving on. You've got to sense that, and but then make sure you come back to the conversation as soon as everybody's able to focus on the conversation.
Okay, next question. What is the best approach to change a manager from their past practice of using the review process as a process for hammering employees?
Yeah. Well, we have a number of tools that we can suggest and that we use, and overriding all the tools like training and guides and coaching and modeling, I think, is that the culture supports this approach. So if that I'll call that an old school manager. If the old school manager is managing that way and delivering the performance evaluation the old school way, there's no reason for anybody to change. But if we see a change of approach at higher levels in the organization, and the executives and managers, the leaders of the organization, are modeling these approaches, really it's a belief that employees have value and have a perspective, then that old school manager is more likely to change. But again, probably not without some kind of systemic support, including practice, training, coaching, those kinds of things.
Okay, and we'll give you one last question here. What if the employee doesn't participate in the questions or the conversation?
So you mean they just don't want to engage, they don't want to play?
That's right.
Yeah. That happens, and I think depending on the industry, depending on the personality of the employee, they may feel that they just want to know, am I getting my raise or not? And partly we're setting the expectation for the employee to participate well before the evaluation meeting. So hopefully if you're meeting with them on a regular basis, weekly, monthly, quarterly, you're doing the same thing, so they start to understand that you truly want to know their perspective. But if you get to the evaluation meeting and they say, no, I don't have any questions, I'm fine with it, then remember the what else 3 times rule. I wouldn't let them off the hook right away. I'd ask them give them at least 3 chances to engage in the conversation, and asking broad, open-ended, probing questions that communicate that you truly are interested in what they think. But let's be real, we got some folks that they're fine with it and they just are ready to get back to work. So I wouldn't browbeat it or demand it any more than just giving them ample opportunity to contribute to the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marnie. This has been just excellent. What an awesome webinar, and I'm sure everybody who participated got a great deal of value from it. I think a lot of practical and useful suggestions are given here today, and a lot of good reminders that sometimes we all forget about. So I really thank you so much. This was excellent.
You're welcome.
If anyone would like to learn more about the content of the presentation, please feel free to contact Management Education Group or CRG emPerform. We want to thank you all for coming and remind you to complete the HR.com survey that will be sent to you after the presentation. Thanks so much.